Okay, so my review of the Veritas router sled hardware kit. First of all, remember that it's a hardware kit. It's not a router sled. So it doesn't come with the rails and it doesn't come with the gantry tubes. But, I mean, those are not very expensive. They're just EMT conduit that you can get at any hardware store. This is not really a how-to video. I'll offer a few tips as I think of them as we're going through the video, but it's really more for someone who's already decided they need a router sled. I just pulled this right off their website. They recommend that you build this frame, which I didn't, but you'll see that. Now here's the trunnion and here's the carrier. I'm telling you those so that you know what I'm referring to as we go through the video. So here's a close-up of the carrier. First things first, after getting it built, I realized right away I didn't want to just drill through. So what I did was I purchased these hold-down clamps and put those on. If you look at the website, the page for the kit itself, the router they're using as an example is a Festool router, and it looks like it maybe has a smaller footprint because it seems to fit better on the carrier plate than mine does. So I just found that given how large the base of my router was in proportion to the carrier plate, it just made more sense for me to put these hold downs here instead, rather than screwing up through or bolting up through the plate. Assembly, by the way, is fairly straightforward. There's nothing complicated at all. But one mistake that I made was the U-shaped bolts that hold the carrier to the gantry tubes. I had pushed those bolts too far through, so the very ends of them, as you can see in this image here, were protruding below the plane of the bottom of that plate, and so that was going to be a problem. That would have been interfering and scratching up the surface of the workpieces. So I had to back them off a little bit by loosening the nuts that are on top of the plate and then pulling up the bolts so that they were no longer protruding, and then tightening them back up again. There's an image of how they looked after fixing that up. And there's just a close-up of one of the trunnions, just so you can see what it looks like to get the bolts tightened up. And that's how it looks overall. Now, as you can see, I did not build the frame that they recommend. I simply adapted it to the bench that I have right now. Essentially, it works the same way. Overall, something I would prefer is some way to make the risers adjustable. I mean, technically, I can adjust them by just unscrewing them and moving them up, but if there were some sort of a screw adjustment on those risers, I would find that a lot handier. So I think I'm gonna think on that and try and maybe adapt something so that I can do more fine adjustments on the risers. Now, of course, the depth of the router bit really is controlled by adjusting the height of the router inside your base, which of course is sitting on top of the carrier. The problem is the carrier is, I don't know if it's 5/8 or 3/4, but it's a fairly thick piece of plywood, and so there's not a lot of play. By the time you get the router bit secured in there nice and solid, and which means you have to push it, fairly deep into the router collet, I find you don't get a lot of room to adjust up and down. Just to get the bit to protrude below the carrier base, you have to get the router fairly deep in the router base, and so I find there's not a lot of adjustment room. While we're on it, the one recommendation I would have for Veritas on this is that they swap out that plywood carrier and make it out of aluminum or something like that, because then it could be thinner and still be as rigid and still be as robust, and there would be more room to adjust the bit up and down by adjusting the router within the router's base. And that's one of the common weaknesses when people make their own router sled sort of DIY style. One of the common mistakes people tend to make is they make that carrier plate very thick, and then you don't have much room to move the bit up and down. When you consider, though, I mean, at the time that I'm recording this kit is only $89.95 or $89.99, I think it is, plus tax, of course. Now, you still have to buy the EMT conduit for the rails and for the gantry tubes, but that's really, I mean, when you consider that once you've got those pieces for around $100, maybe $120, something like that, that's a really very reasonable price, I think, to pay to get a system going. Here, I just wanted to point out, and this is not specific, of course, to the Veritas kit, whenever you're planing using a sled, you have to make sure there's no pivot point under your workpiece. So put some shims underneath it in the corners so that it's nice and secure. And here we are using it. It's nice and smooth. The little nylon guides, I guess they're nylon, I don't know that for sure, but the little plastic guides, they work well. I would prefer having a handle on the carrier, but I'm not exactly sure on what side of the carrier it should go, but I'm going to do something like that. They do recommend in the user manual that you suspend the cord from above, the power cable that is, for your router. I tried that. I found it wasn't working very well, so I ended up letting it down. But then, as you can see in this photo, that's something you've got to watch out for if you don't have it hanging from above. And again, that's not a flaw of the kit. That's just something that happened to me that I'm pointing out that would happen no matter which router sled I was using. Here's one thing that I also found as I was working. I've been working at it maybe 15 minutes or so, and I noticed, despite having, I really thought that I'd snugged up all the bolts and the nuts in fairly well, but I noticed on the floor there was a washer, which obviously was bad news. And then a few minutes later, I found the nut as well. So I stopped the machine, and I found that one of the nuts and washers had fallen out from underneath the carrier. So I had to re-secure that. I would recommend, I didn't have any Loctite or CA glue with me, but I would recommend maybe a drop of Loctite on those. I did snug it up well, and it didn't happen again. I got 2 slabs flattened, and it didn't happen again, but I am going to add Loctite. So there's not much more to say. I mean, really, the bottom line is, for, under $100 for the kit, plus another maybe $25 for the tubes, I added the hold-down fasteners, and then maybe a few modifications that I'd like, a handle for the carrier, but of course that's optional. Really, for certainly under 150 Canadian, well under 150 Canadian, you get yourself a functioning router sled, and it really worked perfectly fine. There were no issues. It's relatively smooth, so I highly recommend it. If a router sled is something that you think that you're ready to purchase, then in my opinion, really when you consider that the price of some of the other models that are available, they're a lot more expensive. And granted, I've never used any of those ones. I find it hard to imagine they're very much better. Some of them seem to be on wheels, so maybe they're nice and smooth. But I mean, this one was really quite smooth as it is. So now, of course, it remains to be seen whether it stays smooth, whether those plastic little guide rollers, those little bushings that allow it to slide on the tubes, whether those hold up, we shall see. But provided that they do, then really, I can't see what else might potentially go wrong with this. So a lot of bang for the buck. Of course, if you're not new to woodworking, then you're familiar with Veritas tools, or if you're familiar with Lee Valley in general because you're maybe a gardener, then you already know that they don't sell very much that isn't high quality. They're known for selling generally very good quality items. So yeah, I would strongly recommend that if you're considering a router sled, I don't see why you wouldn't purchase this one. I'm happy with it. I don't regret the purchase. I don't see the need to turn around now and purchase some other model. This is perfectly satisfactory as long as it holds up, and I can't see why it wouldn't. So that's my review. If you have any questions at all or any insights, by all means, please do add them in the comments because I'm happy to hear your experience. Thanks, everyone. Hope you're well and take care.